So we're constantly faced with questions about what the right thing to do is. Is it okay to pirate a movie? Should you turn in your roommate who you know cheated on an exam? What about things the government does? Is it permissible for them to ban assault rifles or abortions? What about a supervillain? Is it okay for Thanos to have destroyed half the world's population so the other half of the world's population can enjoy the world's resources? So it'd be nice to be able to answer these questions. Even better, it would be nice if we had a principle that we could use in every circumstance to, give us a clear answer about what the right thing to do is. In this lecture, I'm going to defend the Act Utilitarianism principle about what makes right actions right and wrong actions wrong. In particular, the idea is that an action is right in proportion to the contribution it has to overall happiness. So first, I'll explain why Act Utilitarianism is going to be an appealing ethical approach. Then I will consider an objection to this view, that it's going to be permissible to kill one to save five. Then I will consider and ultimately reject an alternative version of utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, that was able to maybe avoid this consequence. Finally, then I'll argue that killing one to save five is actually going to be the morally permissible thing to do. And this should be clear when we consider the trolley problem cases. The principle that I'm going to defend here is known as Act Utilitarianism, which can be stated as performing a certain action is the right thing to do if and only if it has more positive effects on overall happiness than any other available action. So by happiness here, I mean any sort of pleasurable state. This could be physical or mental. And now by happiness, it's also going to be something that's going to come in degrees. And that's also going to include degrees of unhappiness. There can be two unhappy states, but one might be, they're going to differ in levels of happiness if one has more unhappiness than the other. All right, so before we proceed, I need to make two clarifications. First, I need to clarify that Act Utilitarianism is not saying that what is the right thing to do is what makes that particular person happy. Rather, they need to be considering happiness as a whole. So to see that, let's consider the terrorist attack case. Christian discovers that her girlfriend Demi is planning a terrorist attack. Christian knows that if she calls the cops on Demi, it will end their relationship. Demi will never forgive her, and she will feel incredibly guilty about turning Demi in. Christian also knows that if she doesn't tell the cops, countless people will lose their lives and loved ones. Christian decides not to tell the cops, and Demi carries out the devastating attack. Demi is never caught, and Christian puts it out of her mind and feels no guilt or remorse about not preventing the attack. So keeping all of that to herself made Demi overall happier, but Act Utilitarianism is going to say that that was the wrong thing to do. And that's because Act Utilitarianism is going to require us to take into account everyone affected and how they're going to feel, not just the happiness of the person who's performing the action. Now, this means that what Christian should have been thinking about was not just her own negative feelings, but also the negative feelings and the grief of the friends and families of the victims. So when taking all of that into account, it should be clear that Christian should have turned in Demi. All right, the second point of clarification that I need to make before going on is that I'm defending a utilitarian view of morality. What makes a view utilitarianism is that it considers the rightness and wrongness a function of how it affects overall well-being. In other words, it's a function of the things that make everyone better or worse off. The version that I'm going to be defending is going to use happiness to determine the rightness and wrongness of an action. But this is not the only way to do utilitarian calculation. For instance, we can measure people's well-being by how many of their preferences get satisfied, even if satisfying their preferences makes them less happy overall. This is known as preference utilitarianism. Additionally, act utilitarianism is just one way of doing the calculations. Instead, we could use utilitarian calculations to determine how the rules people follow tend to generally affect overall happiness. This is going to be known as rule utilitarianism, and we'll go over this one specifically in a few segments. So there isn't a direct argument for the truth of act utilitarianism, but I'm going to give you a few reasons to take it seriously as a view of morality. So first, act utilitarianism seems to give us a lot of the correct results. For instance, cheating on your partner is wrong because the long-term emotional distress of cheating and trying to cover that up is going to outweigh the short-term sexual gratification. So also suppose that I promise to give you a ride to the airport tomorrow, but then when it comes down to it and I wake up, I would rather stay in bed, and so I satisfy that preference. Well, that action's wrong because your friend's overall happiness or distress of missing the flight and all that is going to be outweighed by your comfort of sleeping in. But then also suppose that I do actually get up and I am driving, I'm on my way to pick you up and take you to the airport. And on the way I see someone who's in desperate need of medical attention. Well, then in that case, it's permissible for me to take them to the hospital even though I know that that means that you're going to miss your flight. And it's right because it is better for everyone involved. So later, we will consider the case of act utilitarianism gets it wrong. But in the meantime, I'm going to suggest you pause the video right here and think about cases in your own life. Does act utilitarianism actually get those cases right? Was it right for you to do the things, and was it right because it made everyone better off involved? All right, well, hopefully you've thought about it. The second reason to take act utilitarianism seriously is that generally morality is, what's going to make people better off and the world a better place. So if an action that I'm performing is going to make everyone involved better off, then plausibly I've done a right thing. And if I've done the best action I can, then plausibly I've also made the world a better place. To see this, suppose for argument's sake, that act utilitarianism actually going to be false. This means that there are some actions that make everyone better off in the world a better place, but those actions are wrong to do. Or something I could do, the right thing would actually produce more unhappiness. So both of these ideas are going to be compatible with the idea that act utilitarianism is false. In other words, it could be the right thing to make the world a worse place, and it could be a wrong thing to make the world a better place. But that seems like an absurd consequence, and so we should agree that act utilitarianism is true. So third, act utilitarianism is also going to be an egalitarian theory. Since act utilitarianism requires us to take everyone involved into consideration, it would be completely against any kind of racist or sexist or any kind of discriminatory law. It would say that those ones are wrong because it's the happiness of the people who are getting the benefits of the discrimination are going to be outweighed by the overall happiness, because there are going to be a lot of people who are feeling oppressed, and that makes them much worse off. And so taking all of that into account, act utilitarianism is going to say that any of these laws are wrong. So this has long been a tenet of act utilitarianism. Everyone's happiness should be given equal weight, regardless of race, sex, gender, any of those stuff. So even when these views weren't that popular to hold. So fourth, act utilitarianism is also going to be able to capture some of the subjective features of morality. Specifically the idea that what makes an action right for one person and makes them happy isn't going to make another person as happy, or maybe it would make them unhappy. For instance, suppose I ask you to close your eyes and I feed you a slice of pepperoni pizza. Well, if you like pepperoni pizza, then I haven't done anything wrong. But if you're a vegetarian and eating any kind of meat makes you feel nauseous, then clearly I've done something wrong in that instance. The same goes for cultural differences. Tipping in the US is customary, while in Japan it would be considered rude. So act utilitarianism is going to say that it's right in one place and wrong in another place, because in one place it's going to add to overall happiness, whereas it's wrong in another place because it's going to take away from overall happiness. However, this is not going to say that all morality is completely subjective. Something is not right or wrong because of what you in particular think. In other words, something does not change from right to wrong just because you've changed your mind. So, to see that, consider the case of condemned lobotomies. The leaders of a certain oppressive country institute a law that requires all newborn girls to be lobotomized. Dissenters were lobotomized as well. After a few generations, there are no more dissenters. The men are all happy with the arrangement, and the women are all lobotomized, and so they have no opinion. So no one in the society thinks that lobotomizing the girls is immoral. Nonetheless, it should be clear to you that what they're doing is immoral. Act Utilitarianism is going to say that it's wrong because half the population is deprived of happy, pleasurable lives. And so the society overall is worse off. Literally, they have half as many people that can even experience happy feelings. And so that's going to be wrong regardless of, how many people inside the country are going to think that it's right or wrong. Unlike tipping, the effects of lobotomy are not going to vary from country to country. Alright, here's our first chance to stop and reflect. In the last segment, I said that utilitarianism is admirably egalitarian, opposing mistreatment of women and minorities. But might it be egalitarian for the wrong reasons? Is the problem with oppression really that the oppressed group's suffering outweighs the happiness that the oppressors derive from the oppression? Saw that Act Utilitarianism is going to give us the correct answer in most of the cases. But sometimes you might think that it's going to give us the wrong answer. Sometimes it might misidentify the wrong thing to do as the right thing to do. In other words, you might think that there are some genuine counterexamples to Act Utilitarianism. To defend this view of morality in a later segment, I'm going to contend that these are not genuine counterexamples. But one might be wondering, is that even really necessary? If Act Utilitarianism is going to give us the correct answer most of the time, then shouldn't that be enough? Well, the idea is that we're not looking for just any rule of thumb. If that were the case, it wouldn't be a very good principle for convincing other people about what the right thing to do is. For instance, you might agree that allowing polyamorous relationships would increase overall happiness. But you might also contend that it's immoral and say that, well, this is just the exception to the rule. So a merely useful rule of thumb when approaching moral questions is going to be a useful principle for how to settle those moral questions. We want an exceptionalist principle. One instance where it misidentifies the right thing to do as the wrong thing to do is going to be enough to falsify the theory. So now let's consider a case where Act Utilitarianism seems to give us the wrong answer. The case of organ distribution. Jonathan is a doctor, and his patient Nick is coming in for a routine physical. Looking over his past blood work, Jonathan realizes that Nick is an exact match for 5 patients in critical condition upstairs in the intensive care unit. When Nick arrived, Jonathan kills him painlessly, making it look like an accident. Since Nick is an organ donor, his body is rushed upstairs, and his heart, lungs, and liver and each of his kidneys are successfully transplanted into those 5 patients, saving their lives. No other organs arrived that day, and the 5 patients would have died had Jonathan not killed Nick for his organs. The 5 patients go on to live long, happy lives, and no one ever finds out that Nick's death was not an accident. So it seems like what Jonathan does here is immoral. Yet killing Nick and saving the 5 led to more overall happiness. Nick's death is going to result in one person's loss of life and one group of mourners, whereas if Jonathan hadn't killed him, then it would have led to 5 people's deaths and 5 groups of mourners. And since 1 is less than 5, Act Utilitarianism is going to say that what Jonathan did is morally permissible. So if this idea is right, then Act Utilitarianism is going to be false. And we can formalize this with the organ distribution argument. OD1 killing Nick has a greater positive effect on overall levels of happiness than letting him live. OD2, if killing Nick has a greater positive effect on overall levels of happiness than letting him live, then, if act utilitarianism is true, then killing Nick was the right thing to do. OD3, killing Nick was not the right thing to do. OD4, so act utilitarianism is false. So OD1 here is going to be true. There are fewer lives lost and sad family and friends. OD2 is also going to be true. Act utilitarianism says, without exception, that an action that produces the greatest overall happiness for everyone involved is going to be the right thing to do. OD3 here also seems to be true. It does seem that killing Nick was immoral. One approach is to concede that the argument in organ distribution is correct, that act utilitarianism is false. Instead, one might support a different version of utilitarianism. In this segment, we're going to consider rule utilitarianism. This is the idea that instead of thinking about how a single action is going to affect overall levels of happiness, we should think about how the rules we follow are going to tend to affect overall levels of happiness. So these are going to be rules like don't kill innocent people, don't steal, don't lie, keep your promises, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The idea is that following these rules generally tend to produce the greatest overall levels of happiness, which is what makes them good rules to follow. So, one way of avoiding the unwanted implications of the organ distribution case is to reject act utilitarianism in favor of rule utilitarianism. So we can formalize the principle of rule utilitarianism as performing a certain action is the right thing to do if and only if it is prescribed by the collection of rules that, if adopted, would have the greatest positive effect on overall levels of happiness. So even though following the rules sometimes will result in some unhappiness, still following that rule more often than not is going to produce the most overall happiness. And you should follow those rules that are going to produce the greatest levels of happiness. A rule utilitarian is looking for that best collection of rules that we should all be following. To see how rule utilitarianism is going to give us the correct answer in organ distribution case, consider these two rules that Jonathan could be following. Don't kill innocent people unless doing so saves multiple lives. Or rule 2, don't ever kill innocent people. So following the first rule would generally produce the overall happiness in the case of the organ distribution. However, this is not going to be a good rule to follow, because if doctors went around killing innocent people, the public would eventually find out, and the people are going to stop going to the doctor, which is going to lead to widespread panic and untreated illnesses. The idea is that even if 5 people were saved for every 1 innocent person killed, thousands would become sick, scared, and live miserable lives. So following the first rule is going to decrease overall levels of happiness, and following the second rule is going to increase overall levels of happiness. Even if there are some instances where following the second rule are going to be suboptimal, overall it's going to tend to increase levels of happiness. So now, rule utilitarianism is going to face their own objections. I will argue that these are going to be more of a problem than the alleged counterexample to act utilitarianism. So recall the example of me promising to drive you to the airport, but then I see someone in desperate need of help. Clearly, the right thing to do is to help that person in need. However, rule utilitarianism is going to say that I need to keep my promise. The idea is that if people were allowed to break promises whenever something came up, that no one would ever trust each other's promises. And when trust breaks down, then this is going to cause serious societal problems. In contrast, the rule that says, always keep your promise will tend to promote the overall levels of happiness. But following that rule means that I need to ignore the person who's in desperate need on my doorstep. And since that seems obviously wrong, it follows that rule utilitarianism is not going to be the correct theory of morality. Rule utilitarians might contend that maybe that's not the rule we should be following. Maybe the rule we should be following is keep your promises unless you have to drive someone to the hospital. That rule would tend to promote the greatest overall levels of happiness, and so we should follow that rule instead of the previous two. But rules can't be that specific, or if they can be, then we can revise them in the case of the organ distribution as well. Maybe Jonathan should follow the rule of don't kill innocent people unless you're absolutely certain that you can do it secretly and that it will save those 5 people with those organs. So following that rule will tend to save 5 people, and it won't lead to the public panic, because we can be certain that the public won't find out. But this is the exact consequence that rule utilitarianism was trying to avoid in the first place. A rule utilitarian is faced with a dilemma. Either the rules can be, relatively general, but that implies that I'm never allowed to break my promise, even if there's someone in desperate need right in front of me. Or the rules can be highly specific, but then that implies that Jonathan should kill Nick. Since rule utilitarianism is either going to be false or unhelpful, let's just set that aside for now, and let's return to act utilitarianism to see how it might respond to the organ distribution argument. All right, now here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. Can you defend rule utilitarianism against the objections raised? OD3 from the organ distribution argument seemed true. That is, it seemed like it was wrong for Jonathan to kill Nick. Although it seemed true, in this segment I'm going to argue that it's in fact false. The argument turns on an analogous case where it's not wrong to kill 1 to save 5. So the case is the trolley driver. Corinne is driving a trolley which is hurtling down the tracks faster than it should. 5 pledges from a local fraternity have been tied to the tracks as part of an initiation ritual. By the time she sees them, it's too late to slow down. The only way to avoid killing them is to swerve the trolley onto a side track at an upcoming junction. But the pledge master, who's asleep on the side track, will be killed if she does. Corinne decides to steer the trolley onto the side track anyway, killing the pledge master. She stops the trolley, unties the pledges, and they all go on to lead long, happy lives. Corinne did the right thing by steering the trolley towards the pledge master and away from the 5 pledges. Now, there doesn't seem to be a morally relevant difference between what Corinne does and what Jonathan does. And without a morally relevant difference, if what Corinne did was right, then what Jonathan did was right. We can formalize this as the trolley argument. TR1. If there's no morally relevant difference between 2 actions, A and B, then if A is the right thing to do, then B is the right thing to do. TR2. Diverting the trolley was the right thing to do. TR3. There is no morally relevant difference between diverting the trolley and killing Nick. TR4. So killing Nick was the right thing to do. TR1 should look familiar. We've seen this principle in other arguments in the past. The idea is that if we can't point to a difference that explains the moral difference here, then it would be arbitrary to say that one is moral and the other is immoral. TR2 hopefully should be obvious. I'm not sure what else I can say in defense of the idea that diverting the trolley was the right thing to do. TR3 also seems to be true. The 2 cases are structurally the same. They're both killing 1 to save 5. Now, if what Jonathan does is wrong, then you must also say that what Corinne does is wrong, or find some other flaw with the trolley argument here. So one might object to TR3 here, though, on the grounds that there's a difference between killing and letting die. The idea is that if Corinne had not swerved off the tracks, then we would have said that she killed the 5 pledges. While if Jonathan hadn't done what he did, then we wouldn't have said that he killed the 5 patients. Rather, we'd be more likely to say that he let those patients die. And killing is not the same as letting die. Killing is much worse. So Jonathan wasn't faced with the choice between killing 1 or killing 5 like Corinne was. Rather, he was faced with the choice between killing 1 or letting 5 die. And since letting die is not as bad as killing, he should have let them die. So the distinction between killing and letting die is quite contentious in the bioethics debate. Many contend that they're actually morally equivalent. But let's suppose for argument's sake that there is a morally relevant difference here. We can still revise the trolley case to make that difference go away. So now let's consider the trolley lever case. A runaway trolley with no driver is hurtling down the tracks towards 5 pledges. Corinne is an onlooker standing beside the tracks. Next to her is a lever which can divert the trolley onto the sidetrack. She can do nothing and let the 5 pledges die, but if she pulls the lever and diverts the trolley, it will kill the pledge master who's asleep on the tracks. Corinne decides to pull the lever, killing the pledge master and saving the pledges. She then unties the pledges and they all go on to lead long, happy lives. Still, what Corinne does seems to be the right thing to do by pulling the lever. But now there's no difference between her actions and Jonathan's actions. If she doesn't pull the lever, then she would have let those 5 people die, just like Jonathan. And now, without a morally relevant difference, the objection to TR3 goes away. Notice, though, that TR2 remains true in the revised case. When faced with the decision between killing 1 or letting 5 die, killing 1 is the right thing to do. Alright, now here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. Were you convinced by the argument that killing 1 to save 5 in organ distribution is no different than killing 1 to save 5 in the trolley cases? So in this lecture, I've defended a utilitarian approach to morality, according to which the right thing to do is always whichever is going to have the greatest positive effect on overall levels of happiness. So I've given strong reasons for accepting Act Utilitarianism. It gives us intuitive answers, it's egalitarian, and it's culturally sensitive without entailing extreme versions of subjectivism. Then, I defended Act Utilitarianism against the objection that it's going to misidentify the right answer in cases where we're having to kill 1 to save 5. Alright, now let's stop and reflect with these 2 questions before we end the lecture. Suppose Act Utilitarianism were true. In that case, in order to know whether something is the right thing to do, one would evidently have to know all of the different ways that an action might affect people's happiness, both in the short term and long into the future. Is that a problem for Act Utilitarianism? How might a utilitarian respond? And the second question, what should a utilitarian say about the morality of eating meat or other animal products?